The morning mist hung low over the valleys of northern Montana as Chris Rivers drove his pickup truck down the winding gravel road toward the Whispering Winds Ranch. October had painted the aspens gold, and the first dusting of snow capped the peaks of the Glacier National Park mountains in the distance. It should have been a beautiful sight, but Chris couldn't shake the melancholy that seemed to permeate the entire landscape. He was heading to a foreclosure auction. Never a pleasant affair, but especially heartbreaking when it involved a family operation that had been running for generations. The Whispering Winds Ranch had been in the Hoffman family for over a century, surviving the Great Depression, 2 world wars, and countless economic downturns. But it hadn't survived the combination of drought, disease, and debt that had finally forced the bank to call in their loans. Chris's own operation, the Triple Creek Ranch, was modest but stable. He ran about 200 head of cattle and kept a small string of working horses. He wasn't wealthy by any means, but he'd managed to weather the recent economic storms better than some of his neighbors. That's why he was here today. Not looking for bargains, but hoping to help some good animals find decent homes. The Whispering Winds Ranch had once been impressive. Even now, with peeling paint and sagging fences, Chris could see the bones of what had been a first-class operation. The main house was a sprawling log structure with a wraparound porch and stone chimneys. The barns were solid timber construction built to last generations. Everything spoke of pride, tradition, and hard work. Now it was all being sold to pay creditors. Cars and trucks were already gathering in the main yard, their occupants studying sale bills and walking through the lots of cattle, equipment, and horses. Chris recognized most of the faces: neighboring ranchers, livestock dealers, and the occasional speculator looking for bargains. It was a small, close-knit community, and everyone knew everyone else's business. The auctioneer was a heavy-set man named Dutch Mitchell, whose booming voice had been calling sales throughout the region for 30 years. He was good at his job, but Chris could hear the lack of enthusiasm in his voice as he worked through the lots. Nobody enjoyed selling off a family's legacy. The cattle went first, decent stock that brought fair prices. Then came the equipment: tractors, balers, and other machinery that had been well maintained despite its age. The horses were scheduled for last, which gave Chris time to walk through the barns and look them over. Most of the Hoffman horses were quality animals. Working ranch horses with good bloodlines and solid training. They'd bring decent prices and find good homes with other working ranches. But in the back corner of the main barn, almost hidden behind a stack of hay bales, Chris found something that made him pause. It was an old stallion, probably close to 20 years old, standing quietly in a small stall. His coat was a rich chestnut that had faded with age, and his mane and tail showed streaks of gray. He was thin, not starving, but clearly not getting the nutrition a horse his age needed to maintain condition. Chris looked for a nameplate or some indication of the horse's identity, but found nothing. When he asked one of the ranch hands about the animal, the young man just shrugged. "That's just old Red. Been here as long as I can remember." Family kind of lost track of his papers and whatnot. "Shame, really? He used to be something special from what the old man told me." "What kind of special?" "Cutting horse, I think. Maybe reining. But that was way before my time. Now he's just there." Chris studied the stallion more carefully. Beneath the neglect and age, he could see the confirmation of a quality animal. Strong hindquarters, good bone structure, an intelligent head despite the dullness in his eyes. This had been a valuable horse once upon a time. The horse sales didn't start until late afternoon. By then, the crowd had thinned somewhat. Many of the cattle buyers had loaded their purchases and headed home. But there were still enough horsemen present to ensure competitive bidding on the better animals. The first few lots went as expected. Good working horses brought reasonable prices, with most going to neighboring ranches where they'd continued doing what they'd been trained for. Chris bid on a young mare that would make a good addition to his string, winning her for a fair price. Then they brought out lot number 41, unregistered chestnut stallion, approximately 20 years old. The old horse looked even worse under the harsh lights of the sale ring. His head hung low, and he seemed confused by the noise and commotion around him. A few people chuckled at his appearance, and Chris heard someone mutter something about dog food. "Now here's an old-timer," Dutch Mitchell announced with forced cheerfulness. "Good foundation stock, I'm sure. Who'll start the bidding at $500? Silence. $250? More silence. The crowd was losing interest, eager to move on to the farm equipment that was scheduled next. $100 then. Surely someone can use an old stallion for pasture ornament. Chris felt a familiar tightness in his chest. He'd rescued enough unwanted animals over the years to recognize the look in the old horse's eyes. This wasn't just neglect. This was defeat. The animal had given up hope. 100. Chris called out. A few heads turned in his direction. Big Jim Cartwright, who owned the largest ranch in the valley, shook his head with amusement. "You collecting strays again, Rivers?" Chris ignored the comment, keeping his eyes on the horse. There was something about the animal that bothered him. Not just the obvious neglect, but something deeper. A sense that this horse had once been important, valued, loved. Going once, going twice, sold to Chris Rivers for $100. Afterward, as Chris was loading his purchases into his trailer, he ran into Fred Hoffman, the ranch's former owner. Fred was in his 70s, a proud man who was trying hard to hide his devastation at losing the family operation. "Appreciate you taking the old stallion," Fred said, his voice gruff with emotion. "Been worrying about what might happen to him." "He seems like a good horse that just needs some care," Chris replied diplomatically. Fred nodded, then looked around to make sure they weren't being overheard. "That horse, there's more to him than meets the eye. My grandfather bought him from a fancy operation down in Texas about 15 years ago. Paid serious money for him too, more than we could really afford at the time." "What kind of fancy operation?" "Can't remember the name exactly. Something with Royal in it, I think. But Grandpa always said that Stallion had bloodlines worth more than our whole herd put together." Fred's eyes grew distant. Then Grandpa had his stroke and Dad took over the ranch. Dad never was much interested in the breeding side of things. Just wanted cattle and working horses. Chris felt a stirring of curiosity. What happened to the stallion's papers? That's the thing. We can't find them. After Grandpa died, we went through all his records, but the registration papers for that horse just disappeared. Could have been lost in the fire we had in '08, or maybe they're still buried in some box somewhere. Without papers, he's just another old horse. But if you could find them, Fred shrugged. Water under the bridge now. Even if those papers showed up tomorrow, wouldn't change the fact that we lost the ranch. He paused, studying Chris's face. But if you're curious, you might want to talk to old Doc Henley. He was the vet who examined the horse when Grandpa first brought him home. If anyone would remember details about his bloodlines, it would be Doc. That evening, Chris got the old stallion settled in a comfortable stall at his ranch. The horse ate carefully, as if he wasn't quite sure the food would still be there if he looked away. Chris spent some time just observing him, trying to see past the neglect to the animal underneath. There was definitely something special about this horse. His movements, even slowed by age and poor condition, showed the fluid grace of an athlete. His head, despite the dullness in his eyes, was refined and intelligent. And there was something about the way he carried himself, a dignity that hadn't been broken by years of indifference. The next morning, Chris called Dr. Warren Henley, the veterinarian who had served the area for over 40 years before retiring. Doc Henley was in his 80s now, but still sharp as a tack, with an encyclopedic memory for horses and their bloodlines. Chestnut Stallion from the Whispering Winds Ranch? Doc Henley's voice crackled over the phone. "Oh, I remember him all right. Beautiful horse. Old Carl Hoffman was so proud of that animal." Fred mentioned his grandfather paid serious money for him. $25,000 if memory serves. And this was 15 years ago, mind you. That was real money for a ranch like theirs. Doc Henley paused, and Chris could hear papers rustling in the background. "I kept detailed records on all the animals I treated. Let me see. Yes, here it is. What do you have?" The horse was originally called Crimson Dynasty, sired by Royal Crimson out of Dynasty's Promise. And Chris, those are some serious bloodlines. Royal Crimson was one of the top cutting horse sires in the country. Chris felt his pulse quicken. Cutting horses? Not just cutting horses. Champions. Royal Crimson's offspring were earning millions in prize money. And Dynasty's promise was no slouch either. She was a daughter of Colonel Freckles, one of the foundation sires of the modern cutting horse industry. My word. So this horse, that horse you bought for $100, could be worth a fortune if his bloodlines are legitimate. Stallions from those bloodlines are still commanding stud fees of $10,000 or more. Doc Henley's voice grew more serious. The question is, why would a horse like that end up forgotten in the back of someone's barn? That question nagged at Chris for the rest of the day. He spent hours online, researching cutting horse bloodlines and trying to piece together the stallion's history. What he found only deepened the mystery. Royal Crimson had indeed been one of the premier cutting horse sires of the late 1990s and early 2000s. His offspring had dominated shows across the country, earning millions in prize money and commanding enormous stud fees. But Chris couldn't find any record of a horse called Crimson Dynasty in the official databases. More puzzling, he found several references to Royal Crimson offspring that had gone missing over the years. Valuable horses that had simply vanished from the breeding world without explanation. The National Cutting Horse Association had even issued alerts about stolen animals, offering substantial rewards for information. Was it possible that the horse now standing in Chris's barn was one of these missing animals? The thought was both exciting and terrifying. If Crimson Dynasty was legitimate, he could be worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. But if he was stolen property, owning him could land Chris in serious legal trouble. He was still mulling this over when his phone rang. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize. Mr. Rivers, this is Olivia Turner from Turner Equine Legal Services in Dallas. I understand you recently acquired a horse from the Whispering Winds Ranch foreclosure sale. Chris's blood ran cold. Who wants to know? I represent certain parties who have an interest in locating missing horses with specific bloodlines. We have reason to believe the horse you purchased may be one of several animals that were stolen from my clients some years ago. I bought that horse at a legitimate auction. I have a bill of sale. Of course, no one is questioning the legitimacy of your purchase. But if the horse is indeed one of our missing animals, my clients would be very interested in reacquiring him. At a fair price, naturally. What kind of fair price? Shall we say 10 times what you paid for him? $1,000 for a horse that's clearly past his prime seems generous. Chris's suspicions crystallized. Olivia Turner was fishing, trying to confirm that he had the horse they were looking for without revealing too much about why they wanted him. The offer was too low for a legitimate recovery. If this horse was really worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, they'd be willing to pay a lot more than $1,000. I'm not interested in selling, Chris said. Mr. Rivers, I should mention that my clients have considerable resources and influence. They're prepared to pursue all legal avenues to recover their property. It would be unfortunate if you found yourself caught up in a lengthy and expensive legal battle over a horse you have no real attachment to. Is that a threat? It's friendly advice. I'll give you some time to reconsider, but I wouldn't wait too long. My clients are not known for their patience. After she hung up, Chris stood in his kitchen, staring out the window at the barn where Crimson Dynasty was housed. Whatever was going on, it was bigger than a simple case of missing papers. Someone wanted this horse badly enough to track him down after 15 years, and they were willing to use intimidation to get him. That evening, Chris drove back to the Whispering Winds Ranch. The main house was dark. Fred Hoffman had moved into town after the sale, but the barn lights were still on. Chris found one of the ranch hands, a young man named Eddie Crow, cleaning up the remaining equipment. Eddie, I need to ask you about something. That old stallion I bought, did anyone else show interest in him before the sale? Eddie looked around nervously. Why do you ask? Just curious. Seemed like an unusual horse to end up forgotten in the back of a barn. Eddie was quiet for a moment, then set down the halter he'd been oiling. There were some people asking about horses a few weeks before the sale. City people, you know? Nice clothes, expensive truck. They were real interested in looking through all the barns. Did they say what they were looking for? Said they were horse dealers, looking for potential buys before the auction. But, Eddie hesitated. But what? They spent a lot of time in that back barn where the old stallion was kept, took pictures, asked a lot of questions about his history. Then they talked to Mr. Fred for a long time in private. Chris felt pieces of the puzzle starting to fall into place. Do you remember anything else about these people? Woman with short blonde hair, real professional looking. And a couple of men who looked more like bodyguards than horse buyers. Eddie's voice dropped. After they left, Mr. Fred seemed real upset, and he moved the stallion to that back stall where nobody would notice him. Like he was trying to hide the horse? Maybe. Or maybe he was trying to protect him. That night, Chris sat up late in his kitchen, a cup of coffee growing cold in front of him as he tried to piece together what he'd learned. Someone had been tracking Crimson Dynasty for years, finally locating him at the Whispering Winds Ranch. Fred Hoffman had apparently tried to hide the horse, but the foreclosure sale had forced him into the open. The question was, why was this horse so important? And what had happened to make him disappear from the official records in the first place? Chris's answer came sooner than he expected. The next morning, he was in the barn checking on Crimson Dynasty when he heard vehicles approaching. Through the open barn door, he saw two black SUVs pulling into his driveway, the same expensive, intimidating vehicles that seemed to show up in every rancher's worst nightmares. 4 people got out. The woman matched Eddie's description: short blonde hair, expensive business suit, the kind of confident bearing that suggested she was used to getting her way. The men with her looked exactly like bodyguards, big, professionally dressed, and alert to everything around them. Mr. Rivers, the woman called out as she approached the barn. I'm Olivia Turner. We spoke yesterday. Chris stepped out of the barn, making sure to close the door behind him. Miss Turner, didn't expect to see you in person so soon. I happened to be in the area on other business. I thought it might be helpful to discuss our proposition face to face. Her smile was perfect and completely cold. Have you reconsidered our offer? I told you yesterday, the horse isn't for sale. Mr. Rivers, I think there may be some misunderstanding about the situation you're in. Olivia's voice remained pleasant, but her eyes hardened. The horse you purchased was stolen from my clients many years ago. We have documentation proving ownership. Then why didn't you come forward during the foreclosure proceedings? Seems like that would have been the appropriate time to make ownership claims. Olivia's smile flickered. There were complications with the legal proceedings. My clients preferred to handle the matter privately. What kind of complications? One of the bodyguards stepped forward slightly. Olivia held up a hand to stop him, but the message was clear. Mr. Rivers, my clients are prepared to be generous. $5,000 for the horse, final offer. But if you continue to be difficult, we'll be forced to pursue other avenues. What other avenues? Legal action, for one. Asset forfeiture proceedings. Investigation into whether you knowingly purchased stolen property. Olivia's voice grew softer, more menacing. And sometimes, unfortunately, accidents happen on isolated ranches. Equipment fails, animals get sick, buildings catch fire. Chris felt a cold anger building in his chest. Are you threatening me? I'm simply pointing out that rural life can be unpredictable. It would be tragic if something happened to your ranch, your livestock, or... She glanced toward his house. Your family. I live alone. Do you? What about that nephew who visits sometimes? Casey, isn't it? Nice boy. Be a shame if he got hurt during one of his visits. The threat against Casey hit Chris like a punch to the stomach. His sister's son was only 12 years old, and he spent most of his summers at the ranch. The idea of these people threatening a child filled him with a protective fury he'd never felt before. Get off my property, he said quietly. I'll give you 24 hours to reconsider, Olivia replied, seemingly unperturbed by his anger. After that, things may become complicated. They left without another word, but the implied threat hung in the air long after their vehicles had disappeared down the road. Chris stood in his yard, hands shaking with rage and fear, trying to figure out what he'd gotten himself into. That afternoon, he called his sister in Billings. Linda, I need you to keep Casey in town for a while. Don't let him come to the ranch. Why? What's wrong? Just some business complications. Nothing serious, but I'd rather not have him here right now. Linda knew him well enough to hear the worry in his voice. Chris, what kind of trouble are you in? The kind that might get someone hurt. Just keep him safe, okay? And if anyone comes around asking questions about me or the ranch, don't tell them anything." After hanging up, Chris went back to the barn to check on Crimson Dynasty. The old stallion was standing quietly in his stall, but there was something different about him. His ears were pricked forward, his head raised alertly, as if he could sense the tension in the air. "What's your story, old man?" Chris asked softly. "What did you see? What do you know that's got these people so worked up?" As Chris was checking the stallion's water bucket, his phone rang. It was Fred Hoffman. "Chris, I heard through the grapevine that some city folks were asking questions about you and the old stallion." "Yeah, they were here, made some threats." Fred was quiet for a long moment. "I was afraid this might happen. Listen, there's something I should have told you when you bought him. If those people are who I think they are, you're in real danger." "What aren't you telling me, Fred?" "My grandfather, before he died, he told me that horse was more than just valuable bloodlines. He said there was insurance. Not the kind you buy, but the kind that keeps you alive. Said if anything ever happened to him, I needed to check the corner post." "What corner post?" "Northeast corner of the stall where you found him. Grandpa was always tinkering with things, hiding things. He hollowed out that post and put something inside. Said it was proof of what really happened, but I was young and stupid and didn't believe his stories about conspiracy and murder." Chris's heart raced. "Fred, why didn't you look for it yourself?" "Because I was scared. And because once I lost the ranch, I figured it was too late anyway. But if those people found the horse, they'll be coming for whatever my grandfather hid. You need to find it first." After Fred hung up, Chris went to the Hoffman Ranch and examined the northeast corner post of Crimson Dynasty's stall. It looked solid, but when he pressed on a particular section about 4 feet up from the ground, he felt it give slightly. With some careful prying with his knife, he discovered a section that had been carefully cut and fitted back into place. Inside the hollowed-out post was a metal box, wrapped in plastic and containing documents that made Chris's head spin. Registration papers for Crimson Dynasty, showing bloodlines even more impressive than Doc Henley had described. Financial records indicating the horse's offspring had earned over $2 million in prize money. And, most shocking of all, a sworn affidavit signed by Carl Hoffman, explaining how he'd come to possess the stallion. According to the document, Crimson Dynasty hadn't been stolen, he'd been rescued. In 2009, Hoffman had been contacted by a veterinarian named Dr. Rachel Montgomery, who worked for Royal Crown Farms, one of the most prestigious cutting horse operations in Texas. Dr. Montgomery claimed that Royal Crown Farms was involved in insurance fraud, claiming valuable horses had died to collect insurance money while selling the animals under false identities to unsuspecting buyers. Crimson Dynasty had been scheduled for euthanasia due to injury, but Dr. Montgomery knew the horse was healthy. She'd managed to smuggle him out of the facility and needed somewhere safe to hide him while she gathered evidence of the fraud. Carl Hoffman, an old friend of Dr. Montgomery's father, had agreed to help. The plan was for Dr. Montgomery to expose the fraud and return Crimson Dynasty to legitimate ownership. But according to the affidavit, Dr. Montgomery had died in a car accident before she could present her evidence to authorities. Hoffman had been left with a valuable horse and no way to prove his legitimacy without endangering himself or the animal. So he'd hidden Crimson Dynasty at his ranch, telling only a few trusted people the truth. When his grandson Fred inherited the operation, Fred had known the horse was special but hadn't known the full story. And when financial troubles forced the foreclosure, Fred had tried to hide Crimson Dynasty to protect him from whoever might be looking for him. Chris sat back in his chair, overwhelmed by what he'd discovered. The horse in his barn wasn't just valuable. He was evidence of a criminal conspiracy that had killed at least one person to protect itself. And now Olivia Turner and her clients had found him. Chris spent the rest of the evening researching Royal Crown Farms online. What he found confirmed his worst fears. The operation was owned by billionaire businessman Victor Andrews, who had interests in oil, real estate, and agriculture throughout Texas and surrounding states. Royal Crown Farms was supposed to be a hobby operation, but it had somehow become incredibly profitable despite showing relatively few horses in competition. More disturbing were the obituaries Chris found. Over the past 15 years, several people connected to Royal Crown Farms had died in accidents. veterinarians, trainers, grooms, even a journalist who had been investigating allegations of insurance fraud in the horse industry. All ruled accidental deaths, but the pattern was suspicious. Dr. Rachel Montgomery's death was among them, a single-car accident on a rainy night, with no witnesses and no clear explanation for why she'd lost control of her vehicle. As night fell over the ranch, Chris made a decision. He couldn't fight Victor Andrews and his organization alone, but he couldn't let them have Crimson Dynasty either. The horse was more than just evidence. He was a survivor, a witness to crimes that had claimed multiple lives. Chris called the FBI field office in Great Falls, asking to speak to someone in the white-collar crime division. After explaining his situation, he was transferred to Agent Deanna Reeves, who listened to his story with growing interest. "Mr. Rivers, if what you're telling me is true, this could be the break we've been looking for. We've been investigating Victor Andrews for years, but he's very good at covering his tracks. What do you need from me? First, I need you to scan and email me all those documents you found. Then I need you to sit tight while we figure out the best way to proceed. And Mr. Rivers, be very careful. If these people are willing to kill to protect their secret, they won't hesitate to eliminate you. They've already threatened my nephew. We'll put protective details on both you and your nephew immediately. But in the meantime, don't let that horse out of your sight." The FBI protective detail arrived before dawn, 2 agents who set up surveillance positions around Chris's ranch. Agent Reeves followed a few hours later, bringing with her a team of forensic accountants and investigators who were very interested in the documents Chris had found. "This is exactly what we needed," Agent Reeves confirmed after examining the papers. Dr. Montgomery's affidavit provides a first-hand account of the fraud, and the horse himself is physical evidence that Royal Crown Farms reported as deceased for insurance purposes. What happens now? Now we build a case. We'll need DNA testing to confirm the horse's identity, and we'll need to trace the financial records Dr. Montgomery compiled. But with this evidence, we should be able to get warrants for Royal Crown Farms and Victor Andrews' other operations. And Olivia Turner? We've been tracking her for months. She's Andrews' fixer, the person he sends to clean up problems that can't be solved with money or influence alone. Her presence here confirms that you found something important. The showdown came that evening. Chris was in the barn, feeding Crimson Dynasty and trying to process everything that had happened, when he heard vehicles approaching. But instead of the black SUVs he was expecting, he saw local sheriff's cars and what looked like a SWAT team taking positions around his property. His phone rang. It was Agent Reeves. "Olivia Turner and her team are approaching your ranch. We have them under surveillance, but we need to let them make their move before we can arrest them. Are you ready?" "Ready as I'll ever be. Remember, act natural. Let them think they're in control. We'll move in as soon as they do anything overtly criminal." Chris walked out of the barn as Olivia Turner and her men arrived. This time there were 6 of them, and they moved with military precision. "Mr. Rivers," Olivia called out, her fake friendliness completely gone. "Time's up. We're here to collect our property. I told you, the horse isn't for sale. I'm not buying him, I'm taking him." She nodded to her men, who began moving toward the barn. "You can choose to cooperate, or you can choose to get hurt. Either way, we're leaving with that horse. Why is he so important to you? He's just an old stallion." Olivia stopped and looked at him with something like pity. "That old stallion is worth $10 million in insurance money we collected when he supposedly died. If he's alive, we're guilty of fraud. If he's dead," she shrugged. "Problem solved." It was exactly the confession Agent Reeves had been waiting for. "FBI, everyone on the ground now!" The ranch yard exploded into chaos as federal agents poured out of hiding positions surrounding Olivia and her men. Most of them surrendered immediately, but one of the bodyguards went for his weapon. The gunshot echoed across the valley, but it was the FBI agent's shot that found its target. The bodyguard dropped his weapon and fell to the ground, clutching his shoulder. In the sudden quiet that followed, Chris could hear Crimson Dynasty whinnying from the barn. The old stallion had survived another attempt on his life. Olivia Turner was led away in handcuffs, still maintaining her innocence despite being caught on recording making incriminating statements. Agent Reeves approached Chris with a satisfied expression. "That went better than I hoped. We got everything we need on tape. What happens to Crimson Dynasty now? Once the legal proceedings are finished, he'll be returned to his rightful owners, or their estate, more likely. Most of the people who originally owned these horses are dead or have given up hope of ever seeing them again. And until then, Agent Reeves smiled. I think he's safest right where he is. If you're willing to continue caring for him, the government would be happy to compensate you for his upkeep. 6 months later, Chris stood in his pasture, watching Crimson Dynasty graze peacefully in the spring sunshine. The old stallion had transformed under proper care. His coat gleamed with health, his eyes were bright with intelligence, and he moved with something approaching his old athletic grace. The trial had been a sensation. Victor Andrews and his organization were facing federal charges for insurance fraud, racketeering, and multiple counts of murder. Olivia Turner had turned state's evidence in exchange for a reduced sentence, providing testimony that implicated dozens of others in the conspiracy. Most importantly, Dr. Rachel Montgomery had finally gotten the justice she'd died trying to achieve. Her evidence, preserved by Carl Hoffman and revealed through his grandson's memory of an old man's careful preparations, had brought down one of the most sophisticated criminal operations in the country. "What do you think, old man?" Chris asked, stroking the stallion's neck. "Ready for retirement?" Crimson Dynasty had officially been declared property of Dr. Montgomery's estate, which had been inherited by her sister. But the sister lived in California and had no interest in horses. She'd offered to sell Crimson Dynasty to Chris for the symbolic price of $1, saying that any horse important enough to hide evidence for 15 years deserved to choose his own home. Chris had accepted gratefully. As the sun set over the Montana mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that matched the stallion's coat, Chris reflected on the incredible journey that had brought them together. He'd gone to a foreclosure auction looking to help some animals in need and ended up exposing a criminal conspiracy that had claimed multiple lives. But more than that, he'd found a partner. Crimson Dynasty wasn't just a rescued horse. He was a survivor, a hero, and now, finally, he was home. The old stallion raised his head, looking out over the vast expanse of pasture that was now his to roam freely. In his dark eyes, Chris could see not just intelligence, but something approaching contentment. For the first time in 15 years, Crimson Dynasty was safe. The secrets he'd carried were finally out, the truth had been told, and the people responsible for Dr. Montgomery's death were facing justice. It was enough. It was finally enough. What an incredible story of justice finally being served. Crimson Dynasty's journey proves that the truth always finds a way to surface. Have you ever discovered something unexpected that changed everything? Share your story in the comments below. If you enjoyed this tale of courage and redemption, hit that like button and subscribe for more amazing stories. Thanks for watching.